very, it's not a bad way to start. So Yevgeny, who is an internet critic and culture critic, basically wrote just a few hours ago at 8:14 a.m. that cooperatives have proven powerless against the capitalism of big tech, asset managers, wealth industry. So the plan is to make them more efficient at being powerless through tokenization, improved governance, and more liquid ownership. So how is that for a start to a session like this? And I immediately wrote back that it is the right answer to the wrong question, but I don't know if there isn't much space to discuss that. So let me just say how we hope to structure this session and what we would like to get out of it. So we want to start with Sylvie and Primavera. We wanted to hear from them more in detail, like 15 minutes each, with a look at DAOs from Primavera and with a look at data trusts from Sylvie. Both you know them from their important work in those areas.
No to tak.
And somebody
Fajnie to zrobiłaś. Fajnie.
muted. Please mute yourself. Okay, muted. And then we take a short break, and then the rest of the participants will share the second half of our meeting. And without losing much time, I want to hand it over. So if you feel inspired by this quote by Yevgeny and basically want to reference that or have a response to that, maybe this could be an interesting way to engage. If not, that's also totally fine. So handing it over to, I think, maybe we can start with Sylvie Delacroix, and who has really, in many ways, become very visible for her work on data trusts, and who is now also practically trying to support data trusts. So not just doing this in theory, but also really engaging with concrete projects on the ground. So super exciting. Welcome, Sylvie.
Thank you, Trebor. First, I want to see, because I don't want to repeat stuff that people already know. And I know some people here have heard about data trusts before. So actually, yeah, it's going to be too many people to ask the question directly. But I'm trying to gauge what I'm going to say, because I don't want to repeat myself. Trebor, should I assume that actually, should I assume nothing in terms of prior knowledge about data trust?
Yeah, I wouldn't assume so much. I think it's always good to start from basic. It's still such an experimental space that there's still so much
Okay.
And cool. I wouldn't take much for granted.
Okay, that's fine. So I'm gonna catch. Let's see.
Close to 70 people already here, so that's fantastic.
Wow, that's great. Okay. Well, I think then I better share my screen and I'll just go through a few slides, and then I'll stop the slides. I don't really like slides that much. Okay, so, all right. Share screen. Okay. And right. So. Okay. So hopefully you all have the right, you have the full slide, right? Because I have several screens, but I think you have the right one. Yeah, data trust. I mean, for those of you who've never heard of data trust, what is a data trust and why is it interesting to us today? I'm going to try and go very quickly because I want to have a conversation more than a presentation. So, we talked about power. Trebor was just mentioning how there's this interesting critique where people say, well, the cooperative movement is lovely, but it has done nothing to basically revert the imbalance of power, right? That's not going to be a scoop to any of you to say that there's a gross imbalance of power between us, the data subjects, and them, let's say, the data collectors. And so at bottom, data trusts are a positive answer to what is first and foremost a political question. And I think people forget that way too often when they talk about data. They forget the political dimension. And that political dimension, or the question behind this, is how and to what extent can we return the power that comes from aggregated data to people, to us, individuals and groups. And our answer to that question is, yes, we can return that power to the people, to individuals and groups, but on condition that we do so with legal instruments that come with sufficient safeguards. Why? Because when you talk about the power that comes from aggregated data, in particular personal data, that power is also concomitant with great vulnerabilities. And so you need, if you're going to try and go about reversing this imbalance of power, you need to do so with legal instruments that come with genuine safeguards. And often, for instance, co-ops, etc., are based on contracts or corporate structures, which, well, don't really come with particular safeguards. They're only as strong as the contracts that create them, right? And that worries me. Now, first to elaborate on this political dimension, because I really want to emphasize that as key and as actually as an answer to what Trebor was just saying. To understand this political dimension, it really helps to bring back home this analogy with something that happened at the end of the 19th century in the UK. I don't know if you know, but at that time, basically, the right to vote was conditional upon land ownership, right? And so people created land societies where they bought a big piece of land, which was then cut into little parcels, so that instead of having one person having the right to vote, you had like 300 or 400 people having the right to vote. And with data trust, the idea is very similar, except that instead of pooling money to buy a piece of land, here what is pooled together is data rights, not necessarily the data itself, but data rights. And by pooling data rights, you effectively acquire a say. Suddenly you acquire a voice over how this data should be used and for what purposes. So you may not acquire the right to vote, but you nevertheless acquire a voice that today I think has become very significant and important, not just from an economic perspective, but also from a political perspective. So now I'm going to go fairly quickly. Data trusts are really a remedy to three problems. Just to summarize, there's a lack of tool enabling long-term collective action, one. Then we all know that data consent today is rarely more than make-believe. We all click away windows telling us, do you consent to this or that? And then third problem is we have a kind of dichotomy between conversations about the vulnerabilities that come from data sharing, okay? And often these are dealt with data rights and top-down regulation. And then on the other side, you have these no less important conversations about the fact that we're missing out on really important common goods because we're not good at sharing data, right? And we can do a lot better. And so data trusts are a way of trying to bring together those two conversations. At the heart of a data trust are the data trustees, and data trustees have a fiduciary obligation of undivided loyalty, and they effectively act as an intermediary layer between us, the data subjects, and them, the data controllers, okay? It helps to think of data trustees as maybe the much needed 21st century profession. So just like in the 19th century, you had the medical profession that came through because of advances in the medical sciences. Today, you could say that advances in data sciences are really calling for a no less important profession, and that would be data trustees. Challenging the one size fits all. Yeah, this is my attempt at drawing something which is shows its limits, but effectively the idea is that you're the person with the little trolley there, and you can choose among a variety of data trusts which come with different priorities. Yes, some people might prioritize financial returns, others might prioritize security of data or sharing of data for common goods, etc., etc. Implementation models, there are many. Yeah, I can't emphasize this enough. There are many ways of creating data trust. Some can be run along like a cooperative, like with very highly participatory structures. Others can be very hands-off. right? So you have room for all sorts of degrees of participation. You also have, this is key, you have room for both centralized and decentralized models. So by decentralized, I mean that you can have data trusts that do not pool any data, right? The data remains wherever it is, whether it's the servers of Facebook, Amazon, or whatever. And the job of the data trust is really to leverage the data rights that have been pulled together to obtain better terms and conditions from service providers like Amazon, or to oversee data sharing agreements. So that's the decentralized model, which could actually run, by the way, some kind of, actually, I'll come to that later, but I'm fascinated about the potential of federated learning techniques to try and keep the decentralized approach, but nevertheless allow members of the data trust to gain insights from data sets that are separate, like say the data sets that my bank has and the data sets that Amazon has, right? Something like that. The centralized approach, obviously, is where data trust tries to pull as much data as it can in a centralized repository. And then you have a third model, actually, which Primavera will probably talk about, where you can also have this approach where you say, okay, we have all these personal data repositories, right? And these are all run by the individuals on their phones, etc. And on top of that, you can then create a data trust to acknowledge the limits that come from the need to make decisions on a daily basis about data sharing. Okay, I'm not going to go into the legal stuff because I don't want to spend too long. Reversing direction of consent, wouldn't that be cool? Yeah, imagine a data trust that has enough people that there's enough power, effectively leveraging the data rights to talk to people like Amazon and say, you know what, either we exercise the right to portability en masse of like 500,000 people, or you talk to us and we determine the terms and conditions according to which the data of all people when they go shopping on Amazon is collected and used. This is key for me, okay? How do we reverse the habit of passivity that has taken hold? Because everything when it comes to data governance today is very much top-down. Yeah, there's top-down intervention, top-down regulation. And this has actually made us super habituated to being passive when it comes to our data. And what I worry about is that the very tech solutions where supposedly we'd be managing data sharing from our little phones, etc., are not addressing this pressing need to create infrastructure where people can learn again to participate when it comes to our data. And I think that's going to take time. And you don't change habits by just clicking your finger. You change habits by creating environments where people can develop new habits, and I hope participatory habits. This is what I was trying to say. New forms of civic participation. This is absolutely key for me. It's way more important than any fancy legal arguments. At the end of the day, that's what I think is crucial. Challenges, there are many. One of them is that, of course, many people are unaware of the fact that they leak data on a daily basis. Very few people actually care about their data, or they don't care enough. Then there's the risk of a race to the bottom. Yeah, how do you prevent a race to the bottom where data trusts are basically competing with each other to monetize data to the biggest possible extent? Well, I think that might be calling for a regulatory intervention at some point to decide which data, if at all, should be monetized and under what conditions. Worth it? Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, which is, this whole trust business, which I haven't bored you with. I haven't gone into the details of trust law because I'd rather have a discussion. But a lot of people say, is it worth it? Why go to such lengths? And I would say, yes, it's worth it because of the vulnerabilities at stake. This is an interesting decision tree to try and understand why data trusts are not the answer to all the problems, right? There are many cases where you're better off with data commons or data co-ops, depending on what you're trying to do. Yeah, so for instance, if I'm trying to share data that pertains to the bottom of the oceans, I'm not creating a data trust. Why? Because there are no personal rights attached to this data. And so, yeah, I can elaborate on that later on. This is the end. Just want to flag up the fact that today we're really in the middle of turning this theoretical discourse into practice, and we actually soon going to launch the first pilots, the first data trust pilots. So this is super exciting. An important moment, I think. There's also, of course, interest from regulators in various countries, but I think unless we have initiatives that come from both the public and the private sector, and both NGO perspective and non-NGO perspective, then we're not going to go very far. I will stop sharing my screen now. And yeah, I managed to be quick. That's good. So yeah, Trebor, I don't know how you want to handle this, if there's questions now or later, whichever.
So I posted in the chat. Thank you, first of all, Sylvie. Second, in the chat, please quickly introduce yourself so that we know like which countries you're from, and also post your questions there while people are speaking. Beyond that, so for Sylvie, I think like one of the most fascinating questions I think that we had in our conversation, Sylvie, is like, what does really empowerment mean, right? When we talk about data trusts or data pools, data collectives, data unions, you know, whichever groupings you want to talk about, what is really meaningful? And I just would love to hear your thoughts, like what's after all these discussions.
So that's a question for me, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And for everybody after that, of course.
Okay,
right?
yeah, because I want to hear your thought actually about what constitutes empowerment. I think there's no univocal answer to what constitutes empowerment. It's a very, well, politically loaded question and morally loaded question. But I certainly would resist any definition of empowerment that tries to limit empowerment to one aspect. Like a typical example is what you see a lot in the US for the moment, initiatives that are very much focused on a very narrow approach to economic empowerment, right? So it can be that, for instance, maybe we're trying to make it easier to obtain loans, and yes, that will empower people in a very particular aspect of their lives, and it will benefit them economically, no question. But is that genuine empowerment? And I'm keen to resist that, because I'm keen to try and have a wholesome approach to empowerment, where I would argue it's dangerous to separate the economic from the social and the political aspects, so that if you cut down your ambitions to only a narrow aspect of economic lives, then you risk actually cutting the legs from the potential inherent in data trust, data co-ops, etc. That potential to me is much bigger than obtaining loans on better conditions. That potential, and that's why I started with the political dimension here, is I think the gravest danger right now is that we are not empowered to have a say through our data about decisions that will have a huge impact in the future and that are data reliant, right? So a lot of the way we shape our future is data reliant. And so this political dimension of data is still poorly understood, and I think it needs to be put under the limelight to effectively say, okay, you know, yes, economic empowerment is important, no question, but if you limited the ambition of data trust or data co-ops to that, then you really risk actually leaving marginalized communities marginalized and just not changing things as they could be changed. Yeah.
Good. So then you can raise your hand if you want to jump into this conversation. So we gave around 15 minutes for the discussion with Sylvia. So economic empowerment, political empowerment came up, right? So through data, I think 2 days ago, I had a discussion with union leaders about using worker data to improve associational power of workers in the gig economy. How else what's your vision? Like, what is your vision behind an empowerment through data and data infrastructures, right? Because it's not just the data themselves, but also the critical infrastructure behind them. There's only so much we can do with the data if there's no, let's say, cooperative infrastructure.
Yes, and it's just my view is that through data, you can actually try and formulate aspirations that will vary, right? So some people will care a lot about better use of natural resources, say. A lot will also care about medical research. Others will worry about the security of the data and more widely, their security to court. And so you can have all these different aspirations that are partly economic but partly political that will surface through choices about data management. And so what I'm trying to argue here is that there's an opportunity to build a bottom-up participation infrastructure, in the sense that unless you conceive, in my view, unless you conceive of data trust, data co-ops, etc., as genuine fora for, well, the shaping of some aspects of our future, right? Whichever aspect it might be, then you're effectively missing a chance to seize upon that political potential inherent in the data, in the power that comes from data rights, basically.
Oh, okay. So Anne-Marie has a question. I mean, you know, this is, I guess, like sort of as a first response, I just would add that there's maybe I would leave it to the workers and users to decide what is empowering to them, instead of sort of maybe having this sort of meta discussion among in academia, right? To say like, well, you know, economic gains are a little bit suspicious, or political gains are a little bit suspicious. So shouldn't it be their or our, you know, collective?
Absolutely. Yeah, but that's why I'm emphasizing that there's room for everything, right? There's room for all sorts of data trust, which will depend, they will be shaped by the groups that come together, and depending on the aspiration. There's no predetermining what is the aim or what are the aspirations behind data trust. They will come in all sorts of shapes and colors. And what I do worry about is also approaches that limit data trust to a particular role. So this is an interesting question, actually, which is, what do you do if you create only data trust around roles, which might be job related, or they might be, let's say I'm a mother, I'm an Uber driver, and I live in social housing, let's say. Yeah, these are different aspects of my life. And I might then be a member of different data trust because of each of these roles in my life. How does that empower me? Yeah, let's say my son is in a school which creates a data trust. I'm an Uber driver, which creates, you know, data trust to get better terms and conditions. And then I'm social housing with smart meters or smart features that mean there's creation of a data trust. Is that the right way? Or do we create more generalist data trusts that are trying to empower groups of people that share common aspirations without limiting to one particular type of data or a particular type of role? And then you have meta trusts that specialize in, say, health research or whatever. These are other questions that I don't want to jump to too quickly, because I'd rather hear your questions.
Yeah, Anne-Marie has her hand up for.
Yes, many thanks for the talk. I'm not an expert in neither data trust nor blockchains and DAOs and all this, all the like, but I have two questions concerning one. It's technical field, and the other one is exactly what you're going to do with the data, concerning both the data trust pilot, but also in general, what kind of, what projects you have in mind. So the technical field would be, if that data trust pilot it's probably based on blockchain. So I'm wondering whether you use a specific one, for instance, Ethereum, with maybe smart contracts or something like that, and how you are intending, or how the participation is built. So is it built on the idea of a DAO, so everyone can kind of like participate within a certain time frame? So I'm wondering about the process and the technical side on it. And then the other one concerns exactly what Trebor just said, namely, so if we consider data as the new oil, and it's then a resource or an asset, or do you have in mind that people can do with their data what they actually want to do. So maybe it's a resource and they want to invest, or they want to contribute to a certain cause they believe in, like, hey, climate change or smart meters, what you just mentioned. Or could they also exchange it, maybe like in a basically like a trade agreement or in a trade establishment, where you had it with your data trust pilot, or maybe with your other projects?
So, so first on the blockchain thing, there's no need for data trust to involve blockchain. They can if they want, but they don't have to. So you can have a data trust, as I said, you can have a data trust that does not pull any data, right? That does not seek to centralize any data, and that really leverages the rights to obtain better terms and conditions. Because you say, okay, like I can exercise en masse the right to portability of 500,000 people, or you talk to me, you know, that kind of thing. So this is one model. You can have data trust that will rely on various types of technical solutions. And here I really don't want to preempt. It's always dangerous to preempt what can be done, because actually there's all sorts of things that can be done, right? And so the pilots, sadly, I can't, it's still confidential because we're shortlisting them, right? So I can't really tell you in advance, but watch this space. In January, they'll be announced. So in January, it'll be all known to the world what the first pilots are. But yeah, at this stage, I can only say that there's all sorts. That it doesn't tell you much, but there's really like, it covers, you know, it can be from fishing activities to health-related data via community-based initiatives, geographically defined. So yeah, what's interesting with data trust is that they can take so many shapes and forms. So what unites them? And I would say what unites them, in my view, or in the perspective of data trust initiative, is really this bottom-up empowerment imperative, right? So that if they're not defined by this ambition, then they're not data trust, they're something else. And there's a lot of other things right now, and actually some sharkish also initiatives that try to dress themselves as data trust because it sounds good, but they have nothing to do with bottom-up empowerment, right? And then it becomes quite dangerous, because it sounds good, data trust, and it promises all sorts of things, but if it's just about basically acting as an intermediary and getting a little bit more money in the process, then you haven't really empowered anybody. So yeah.
Okay, and there's Ian.
Okay, it's a really interesting presentation, and I'm hoping you can hear me okay.
I can.
Good. I'm thinking that this is maybe about citizenship. So how do we identify ourselves as citizens within a data space? So we live in the world, and the UK, we've gone from being citizens of Europe to being subjects of the Crown in Parliament. So we are, losing our our sense of ourselves, and we have to be humble towards the Queen and everything. So it's not looking too good. And the big co-ops, those big consumer co-ops in the UK, haven't addressed data rights at all. So there are 4.5 million members of the co-op group, and the notion of some sort of identity as a member of a co-op with data is never discussed. I try to discuss it, and people say, what are you going on about? What's your problem? So I think there's a big educational thing I think it's about citizenship and about identity, and about an identity within the virtual world, an identity within the physical world. And if we're thinking positive, then isn't that about some sort of emancipation and liberation process? And
yeah, I like that, actually. I like that because you're really pressing the finger on that political dimension and the education aspect. That's one of the things. Actually, just before this talk, I had a call with someone who specializes in governance for biobanks, and we were discussing under what conditions is it not just a theoretical dream to say you're going to create a structure to empower people to participate, to have a say over how their data is used? Because one of the obstacles is, well, a lot of people are not aware, and then a lot of people are used to being passive. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg question where you can say, look, I'm here advocating for the creation of these infrastructures to enable us to learn new forms of participation. But then you could say, yes, Sylvie, that's lovely. But if nobody's interested in participating, then your beautiful data trust will remain very empty and useless. And so how do you, how do you beat the chicken and egg problem? Like, how do you actually say, you know what, yes, it is worth creating this infrastructure that enables bottom-up participation, even if at the moment, I recognize that few people will be bothered. And what's interesting is that in the medical domain, what we know works well are communities defined for those communities of patients who share a rare disease or a chronic illness are typically communities that are that have very strong participation rates when it comes to managing their data. I mean, this is a very good example of groups that have both an awareness and often a very proactive attitude. At the moment, they're not constituted as data trust, but nothing would stop them from being so. And so this is one of the questions where can this model of participatory governance scale beyond these niche contexts where, say, we share the same rare disease or the same chronic illness? I hope so. But I recognize that a lot of education will be needed, as you said. And that education is not academic education. It's an education where you learn through practice and through being in an environment where people start caring. And that's why the theory, I think, is actually time has passed. It's really time for practice now and for trying things and seeing what works and what doesn't. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have space for one more question while more and more people join this conversation. This is amazing. I think, Sylvie, also one thing that I always enjoyed about talking with you is that you also said, of course, what really matters are the principles or the goals, right? This empowerment. It's not really only about data trust. So if something else gets done, then, given the limitation that it's really just GDPR and California where this applies, right? So like maybe there are other solutions that also might come to this. But Columbine had her hand up, if I identified this correctly.
Oh, yeah, I didn't have I was just sort of building on what you were just saying, what Sylvie and Ian were just saying, that's sort of what struck me too, listening, is the education. I guess I'd even go beyond that to say narrative building and culture building and just even broader. I think that's a challenge. I also see both that co-ops don't understand the tech part and most people don't understand the co-op part. I'm just speaking from the US and Los Angeles. So yeah, I guess I'm always interested in projects that are trying to really explain even the core concepts of organizing or bottom-up power building and things like that. So yeah, just adding, and curious if there's other projects like that.
Yeah, and I'm actually really interested to hear, as Trebor was saying, I'm acutely aware of the fact that data trust at the moment, first they are unicorns in that they don't exist yet. We're trying to make them exist, but also they are only really feasible in contexts where there are data rights in place, which means GDPR or countries or California at the moment. What's really interesting is then can you create data trust in countries that don't have data rights? It might be possible, actually, that there are routes that could allow that, but that's not really what I'm interested in. Like, this is a legal question. What I'm really interested in is how do we actually create this bottom-up empowerment, let's call it culture or infrastructure, that is missing. And I do believe decentralization tools like personal data repositories have a role to play, but they're not the end of the story. I don't think there'll be enough to create precisely that environment within which people learn to participate. It's too individualistic in nature to overcome the obstacles that as I see them. But please disagree with me if you do. I'd love to hear.
Okay, thank you so much, Sylvie. Now I know this. I would love this to go on forever, and maybe one day we do a marathon and just talk for 24 hours. Only about data trust, but I hand it over to Primavera, who is already on standby. greetings to Harris.
Thank you. Yeah, same thing. I will share my screen for a little bit, and then I think we just open up to the discussion because this is more interesting.
And again, like if either of you wants to respond to Yevgeny's provocation, that would always be welcome. Curious, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna respond in detail. Yeah, so I think I will also assume that there is a average understanding of what a DAO is, and just go into it. So a very basic, it's really difficult to actually provide a definition of a DAO, but a very basic one could be a blockchain-based system that enables people to coordinate themselves via self-executing rules deployed on a public blockchain. This could qualify like as a smart contract in many ways, with the possibility of engaging people within the system. So a smart contract is something that is purely algorithmical. A DAO is a smart contract that require humans' intervention in order to engage into the governance. And this specificity, and this is kind of like, this is a difficult, this is a fine line, is that the governance of a DAO, in order to qualify as a decentralized autonomous organization, it needs to be technically decentralized, even though that does not mean that it is operationally so. And what I mean by this is that if you do have a smart contract where there is one owner, or there is a very limited set of people that do control the smart contract, most likely this will not qualify as a DAO. Whereas if the design, the technical design of the smart contract is such that there is a decentralized governance structure, and these generally involve the implementation of a token-based system, whether it is an economic token-based system, whether it is a reputation-based system, but a model in which people can acquire specific tokens and then engage into the governance. And so technically, if we look at the smart contract, we can see that this is designed in a decentralized manner. But of course, there is no guarantee that the operations of it remain decentralized, simply because it's very possible that one or a few actors actually collect a large majority of those tokens and therefore become the dominant player into the governance of this DAO. And again, this is a fine line because there is no official definition of a DAO, but as a general rule today, in like the general language of it, there is a lot of DAOs which are still qualifying as DAOs and therefore as decentralized autonomous organization, even though their governance is highly centralized. What is a co-op? So just as a way of trying to compare, cooperatives are people-centered enterprise which are jointly owned and democratically controlled, and democratic is an important word, by and for their members to realize their common socio-economic needs and aspirations. And one important component is that cooperatives are run according to the one member, one vote rule. And this is, I think, the important point that somehow creates a complexity when we are observing DAOs and the extent to which they can be used to implement co-ops. So I will just spend a few minutes to give a few examples of DAOs that somehow present themselves as cooperatives. One of the first one that is from 2015 was Salus, which was an Ethereum-based attempt at creating a decentralized Uber. And essentially the idea, like a ride-sharing platform, which does not involve this centralized operator. And the idea was to create a real-time mechanism of ride sharing, and therefore there needs to be a lot of users. And how to attract users? Well, the best way is to provide tokens to them. So the idea is that people that are providing rides will accumulate tokens. And then, of course, those tokens becomes the way by which people can access the services and enhance the value of the token depending on the demand for rights. And so this actually was, the model was really conceptualized as an attempt to create a cooperative-like form of ride-sharing platform where there is no shareholder, but the workers, in this case the drivers, are the ones that hold the tokens, and therefore that also engage both with the economic returns, but also potentially with all the governance questions that might arise over time. Unfortunately, Lazuz actually did not succeed. One of the main reasons was actually that it was actually trying to be run as a decentralized organization before we even had any tools for managing decentralized organizations, and somehow it didn't materialize in the way in which it was hoped. So we don't know whether or not it would have managed to instantiate itself as a co-op. We have another one, which is also a ride-sharing application, which is called EVA, which again is presenting itself to be owned in a cooperative manner by the people that are actually providing the rights. And the idea is really that the resources, so as opposed to a traditional ride-sharing platform like Uber, in which the profits are actually extracted by the platform operator, in this case, the funds that are obtained are redistributed to all the drivers and all the members of this cooperative. And then we have more like abstract platforms. So there is a bunch of blockchain-based initiatives which are presenting themselves as tools in order to enable cooperatives, or in order to enable specific communities to instantiate themselves as DAOs. And most of them do use the narrative of the cooperative. Perhaps Colony is like the one that used the stronger narrative. Aragon's, which also created a particular subset, which was Aragon Co-op, in order to favor cooperative approaches on deploying DAOs. And then DAO Stack also, which promotes somehow this narrative of worker-owned organizations and so forth. Which it's also interesting because those are all initiatives that emerged quite many years ago, and at least two of them have pivoted. So Aragon now is mostly focused on traditional corporate, providing tools for traditional corporate governance. DAO Stack also has pivoted into creating more commons-oriented type of application. So while the narrative was very strong at the beginning, now it's more about creating tools for organization more generally as opposed to cooperative. And then we have DisCo. I probably will not spend much time on it because we actually have Stacco that I believe will present it, but which is also a framework for decentralized collaborative or cooperative organizations, which is much more focusing on the cooperative values and feminist value, and with guerrilla translation being perhaps the first instance of adopting this model. And then finally, we also have existing cooperatives which are moving into the DAO space. And so we have Nexus Mutual, which is providing a mutualized insurance system, which is incorporated as a cooperative and which is then deployed as a DAO. And this is basically, once again, it's the company doesn't have like this traditional shareholder system, but it's run and it's governed by its member, and the members are actually also the decision maker about which claims are valid and which claims are not valid, and so forth. So those are just a few examples, and just as maybe that's when I can address Martha's quote. Basically, there is this idea that a DAO is a company that doesn't belong to anyone. It is autonomous. There is no shareholders, and there is this intention of shifting away from the notion of shareholder towards this more pragmatic and more comprehensive concept of stakeholders. But in the end, if we look at how all of those systems are implemented, they mostly and like exclusively rely on token-based governance. And when we talk about token-based governance, of course, it's nice because that means that contributors can earn tokens, and that means that we are moving more close to worker-owned companies and so forth, because the more you contribute to the DAO, the more tokens you own, and therefore the more you can benefit from the economic rewards and the governance privilege. But of course, once we create tokens, we also cannot prevent investors from purchasing those tokens. And so when we talk about stakeholder, we're also not completely eliminating the notion of shareholders. But also, most importantly, when we talk about token, and if the accumulation of tokens is actually determining both the return on investment and the governance power, then we're moving really far away from the democratically run type of organizations, and we're moving more into those plutocratic models in which the more resources one can invest, either financially or otherwise, then the more influence they have on the organization. And then just as to open up for discussion, so what would be the condition for a DAO to actually qualify as a co-op? So here I took the 7 cooperative principles that qualify a co-op. So voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training and information, cooperation among cooperative and concern for community. And when we actually try to apply those to DAOs, we can see that actually there are 2 big issues. Number 2, which is pretty much, I spent a few hours almost trying to find a DAO that will actually be democratically governed. Just to give an example of a one person, one vote type of DAO, I had a very hard time, I couldn't find one. And this is interesting because it's not impossible at all. There is a lot of communities which are not pseudonymous and which know each other really well and could implement, if they wanted to, a democratic system of governance, and yet everyone is always falling back into this tokenization model. And something with like voluntary and open membership, of course it is open, but it is open to, of course, the people that contribute financial resources, at least in the case of token-based voting. And so we basically have voluntary membership, yes. We have member economic participation, definitely. Autonomy and independence, most likely, most of the time. And then 5, 6, and 7 is a little bit more complex to assess, but it is need to be done on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, basically those 7 cooperative principles are hardly met at the level of number 2 and partially number 1. And just to conclude, why is it that we have so little democratic governance in DAOs? Well, one argument can be that, of course, it's very difficult because we actually don't have the notion of a person. There is very little input on who can constitute one person as opposed to creating millions of accounts. And of course, there are many initiatives that are emerging, each trying alternative tools in order to reintroducing this notion of personhood on the blockchain, whether it is like with proof of humanity, with biometrics, with actual capture and so forth. So there's a lot of mechanisms that are emerging. And perhaps this is one possibility, is that if the system becomes more established and more widely adopted, we might start seeing some DAOs that implement democratic governance structure. But until then, it's actually very difficult without actually falling back into a centralized system that is making sure of identifying every single account as a unique person. And in that case, do we actually lose the decentralization aspect of the DAO? But yeah, so basically there seems to be like a complexity at the level of democratic governance due to the pseudonymity that is inherent in the blockchain.
Great. Let's jump into questions. And anybody feel free to link this back to Yevgeny's provocation as well. Maybe this can be a nice, maybe Sylvie, I don't know if Sylvie wants to respond, or, and then there's Jad, of course. Yeah, Jad, did I see your hand? Oh, no.
I was just clapping for Primavera.
You were clapping.
I just find it fascinating what Primavera was saying about, you know, the lack of democratic control and how inherently challenging it is to go back from, if you start from a tech infrastructure that is designed around effectively anonymization. I mean, it's how do you go back? Can you do a return movement that enables democratic participation, which needs persons? As Primavera was, I think that is a fascinating question, and this is why I don't know, I always think of this as which problems are you trying to solve, and in some ways there's prioritization of problems. Like if you put first sometimes when you put tech solutions before some of the problems, you create more problems, you know, and I think this is part of what's happening here. We've created a problem by going, because we have these tools, we have these fancy tools, but have we answered the primary problem, which is really about reversing the power imbalances, to go back to where we started this session? Well, no, and while there can be decentralization tools, these tech tools, unless you have genuine bottom-up empowerment as tools, which actually need persons, they don't need tech, they need persons, then we're gonna run into a problem. So this is a very interesting. I mean, I'm guilty of a philosopher instinct. I always think more abstractly, but I think about, you know, the impact of the problems you focus on first, and this is really the danger I find, is that when you go for tech solutions because you have them without necessarily thinking, is that the problem I want to try to solve? Then you run into problems.
And I think that if I can try and relate this with Eugenie provocations. I think in many ways it's like I actually don't think it's a technical problem. I think it's completely doable with the current technology that we have to create a democratic DAO. It of course do require that there is a centralizing element, but technically we can create a democratic DAO, which while the identity factor is centralized, the operation of the DAO can remain decentralized. And I think it's that there is no incentive, there is no desire to do so, and that's where I think Eugenie is quite correct, in the sense that the reason that many DAOs decide to adopt a token-based system is because there is an actual economic incentive to do so. Because, well, if you do well, then the token will increase in value. And that's great, because that also means there is a good business model for the cooperatives. But that also means that the cooperative is not a cooperative. So in some way it is, I think, attracting a lot of people that come with the cooperative values, which have these notions, like really like work-owned type of cooperative. But when seeing the opportunity, if you have to choose between, well, do you want to have one person, one vote, or do you want to have a token-based system in which the more you contribute, the more you're going to earn, and then there will be a secondary market for the tokens and so forth, then there is obviously a strong motivation in adopting a token-based system, because one, there is a good narrative around it, which is, well, actually you want to reward the people that contribute, right? And the more you contribute, then the more you should be rewarded. And secondly, because, well, that's also great that you can somehow channel all this speculative money back into the system. But of course, that means that at some point you start being, as your organization start also being slightly corrupted by those new dynamics, right? And so I'm not sure if I necessarily agree about the fact that it's the technology creates the problem. I mean, it does create. I don't think the technology is a limitation. I think it's the adoption. It's the way in which those technology have been chosen to be implemented, which actually creates the problem.
Okay, there's Anne-Marie and there's now Jad. So let's spend just a few more minutes, let's say really 5 minutes. Maybe we can hear both questions and then have Sylvie and Primavera both respond. And we take a short break and 5 minutes, and then we go into the second part, okay? So Anne-Marie and Jad, with short questions.
Thanks. Thanks for this input. I was wondering about your perspective on the issue of trust. So if cooperatives are mainly based on people, so in an analog way, even if they are maybe organized on digital platforms, they more or less know each other, they are aiming at making dire situations better or tackling a problem. Whereas DAOs, especially in the environment of tech people who are very much aware of the problems of hackers, and basically blockchain and also DAOs based on blockchains, they circumvent the issue of trust. So I'm wondering your perspective on this, if like this is just an assumption, what I just said, but your perspective on it, whether it's possible to bring this very important value and resource of trust for social cohesion back into DAOs and blockchain as such. Although actually it is very much based, this whole concept and this whole technology is very much based on exactly circumventing this, this value, this issue of trust. That's very complex, sorry for that.
Now let's hear from Jad and then hand it over to both.
Yeah, so my questions may be slightly different, but I love the point around like us shaping our tools and then our tools shaping us. Like a lot of the technologies and the tools that we have today that address, DAOs were born out of human needs, and then now they're sort of shaping how humans interact in these communities. And I wanted to propose perhaps one framework for how we can value contributions in the community and how that can spin off financial incentive. I just wanted to hear Primavera and Sylvie's perspective on this. But one thought that I had was, what if contributions in a community issued kind of a reputation token, one that can't be sold or transferred, and then that then kind of ends up giving away some sort of transferable token that also increases in value over time. So separation, basically two token types within a community. Curious if any of you have thought about that or if there are any considerations there.
I'm not sure I can answer the two questions at the same time. They are too different with one another. So in terms of Anne-Marie's, yeah, I think to me it's a very good question, and this is kind of like the heart of my research actually, which is there is this important distinction to be made between trust and confidence. And when we talk about a trustless technology, actually what we're talking about is just a technology that is trying to maximize confidence about a particular set of operations. And so DAOs are about increasing confidence. Because you increase confidence, of course, there is never any way you can codify everything into a DAO. There is like millions of social interactions that will not be codified. But because you have increased the confidence in the system, then you don't need to trust from 0 to 100. You have like 50% of confidence, and then you only need to trust 50%. And so in some way, like if you actually design the system correctly, you're identifying all the things that can be codified and that actually can increase, can benefit from increased confidence, and then you put all those things on the blockchain, so that then it becomes easier to trust, to establish relationship of trust, because this trust is smaller. I don't need to trust you all the way in. I just need to trust you for whatever I could not codify into the confidence machine. And so, of course, like any attempt at eliminating completely trust then is eliminating the whole notion of community. And maybe that's really great for financial applications, but that might be a problem for many other type of social organizations. But I think there is an interesting interplay into, because today we actually have kind of lost trust in a lot of our existing institutions, especially online operators, and embedding some blockchain-based guarantees, technological guarantees into the way in which they operate might actually enable us to restore or to reestablish a relationship of trust. Concerning Jad's question, if I probably understood that you're asking about like the possibility of having both transferable tokens such as economic market-based thing and reputation-based token which are not transferable. Yeah. So there's lots that are doing that. DAOstack was specifically designed around this, and yeah, that's great, of course, because it eliminates the market-driven dynamics that might at least corrupt part of the organization, and actually enabling the economic dividends to be market-based, whereas the governance is not market-based. But yes, and at the same time, of course, it becomes, so it's meritocratic, right? Like you're still not into a democratic model, you're into a place in which the more influence you have, the more contribution you've done, or whatever else is determining the amount of reputation you get, the more power, the more influence or governance privilege you get, which is somehow this is where we land in a pseudonymous system. This is perhaps the most fair approach that we can have in a place in which we do not have one person, one vote. But of course, this is very far away from being like a democratic system.
I think I would just say 2 words. Is basically the way in which you choose, well, the tools you choose to reinstate trust, and the types of institutions you try to build in that process are themselves a value-loaded choice, right? So trying to reinstate trust via tech tools only, because tech tools will be needed, and I'm just saying tech tools to be very general, so it can be DAOs, it can be something else. But what I'm trying to say is I think what's lacking, so yes, we do not trust, there is no reason to deem the data collectors of today as trustworthy institutions. But do we have any way of holding them to account? No, so there is also an imbalance of power underlying this. And I worry that if you focus too much on trust and then saying, oh, so we need tools to rebuild trust without acknowledging this imbalance of power, you risk in the process creating tools that will actually facilitate the status quo in the longer term. So that's my worry. I should stop there.
Great. Like I said, this is material for a marathon, a discussion marathon, and maybe we will really hold this in 2022, or maybe at the next PCC conference in Rio de Janeiro next year. But for now, as I say, thank you to Sylvie and Primavera, and we're taking a short break for 5 minutes. Yeah? I stopped the recording and we will return in 5 minutes for the second part. Thank you again, Primavera and Sylvie. Maybe some applause. I don't know, we can't really hear it, but we can see it. Okay, so many black boxes, so not so impactful, but imagine a sea of people applauding you. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so we are back for the second part, very exciting. So we have, for the second part, Jad Esber, from whom you heard already. He's the co-founder of Koodos and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center. We have Stacco Troncoso, which is the co-founder of DisCo.coop. And we have Katya Abazajian, a fellow at the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. And also, I think co-author or author on an important report by the Mozilla Foundation, which you might be familiar with. And then there's Javier Creus, who is the co-founder of Salus Co-op. There was a question in the chat about examples of data cooperatives. So Salus, of course, is an important example of data cooperatives. So I wanted to just all participants to briefly introduce themselves, and then we can continue the discussion, and maybe again, like use as a framing this sort of provocation by Evgeny, which I'm still thinking about, and see what the rest of the participants think about that. So maybe starting with Jad, and then going on from there. So just introduce yourself and your work and your relevance to this topic briefly.
For sure. Well, I'm Jad. I am an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center. I study social spaces and creative tools and how they intersect with decentralized tech. I'm also a builder. I start a company in the space and just build a bunch of experiments kind of around this space. And I'm excited to chat with everyone here.
Excellent. I don't know. Who wants to go next? Javier, Stacco, Katya, maybe Katya. I don't know. Sure. Mixing it up a little bit here.
Yeah. My name's Katya Abazajian. I'm a fellow at the Beeck Center, as Trebor said. I work directly with community organizations, local and state governments on uses of data and technology, and to that end, participate in a number of advisory groups and work groups attempting to establish data cooperatives in practice in the civic space and in the public interest tech space. But of course, that community is a little bit removed from this community and looks different and has different definitions of what cooperatives look like. So I'm constantly trying to bridge those worlds, but also really interested to hear about folks' opinions and ideas to take those back to kind of the practitioner space. I also helped co-author a report as part of the Mozilla Foundation's research series on data for empowerment, which I think a number of people here probably were involved in reviewing as well, but did quite a bit of research on builders and the ecosystem of support around builders for alternative data governance mechanisms there, and focused a little bit on the gaps in the space, and particularly where builders need more support. And one of the major findings, which I'll drop a link to that report after this, but one of the major findings was that a lot of builders need help around identifying demand, understanding demand, generating demand, And I think that gets to a lot of the points that Sylvie and Primavera addressed earlier around education and opportunities to integrate these technologies with actual communities that need them, as opposed to just with our kind of usual suspects. So I'm excited to talk more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, very exciting, and would love to hear these examples that you talked about of existing data cooperatives and how they maybe differ and how they think about data co-ops, because I think one thing that I mentioned also in the panel this morning on unions and cooperatives is that, you know, we want to really sort of avoid these, you know, circular firing squads where there's a sort of fetishization of one particular organizational form over any others. And instead, like encourage really like a more pluralistic approach that embraces also hybrid forms and co-op adjacent forms and social movements, right, as well as unions.
So I'm Javier Creus. I'm one of the founders of Salus Co-op. It's a non-for-profit citizen data cooperative for health research. Since November 11th, citizens can download an app where they can share their data in the 5 conditions. We co-designed with citizens a contract, a license. Citizens can lend their data to research institutions of their choice. Under these 5 conditions, we designed with them public health projects, non-for-profit institutions. Results will be published open, anonymity, and you can quit at any time. We're doing that with 5 very important research institutions in Catalonia. And I believe it's taken us 5, we use decentralized engines, zero knowledge, interplanetary file system for each personal repository, blockchain for the consent of the researchers, and the consent of the citizens each time they lend their data. And what I've learned in the making of this is that it's not about technology, it's about trust and purpose. And data trust are re-engineering of trust. We've been able to gather the trust of the Mobile World Capital, of the health department, of the Catalan government, of the cooperative movement, of the research institutions, of citizens by co-designing the license with them. And our purpose, which is very narrow, is to create data abundance. One way we citizens get seat at the driving wheel of the data revolution is managing abundance and scarcity. And if we create abundance for the purpose of the common knowledge, I believe we are making a small contribution, but the problem is much wider of course. Thanks.
So I'm Stacco, I'm the co-founder of DisCo.coop, and DisCo is a melting pot of alternative economics. It stands for Distributed Cooperative Organizations. So of course, that's a reference to DAOs, but very explicitly about cooperatives. And what DisCos do is that they give you a framework to put your productive, or indeed anyone's productive capacity, towards care work. Caring for what? Caring for each other as human beings and caring for the non-human world and the environment. I will quote Sylvie from a few minutes ago. As I said, we need practical education where people start caring, and DisCo is one way to achieve that education. And also, based on another comment that she made, it's a way of engaging with the problems before we design the technical solutions. DisCo is based on feminist economics, on the commons, on DLT and open value accounting, which is something that preceded the blockchain and DAOs in measuring contributions to shared projects. In the next round, I will speak a little bit more about what I feel the tension is between DAOs and co-ops. It's like we seem to want to create this marriage, but do we really know what we're getting into?
Okay, so then let's open this up. and see how there are commonalities, maybe continuing this conversation that we had earlier on. There were so many questions here in the chat, and still this sort of framing question, maybe, or framing provocation from Yevgeny. Like perhaps co-ops are just like, you know, as so many scholars would say, right, are not changing the DNA of capitalism. So why bother scaling them through data trusts or scaling them through DAOs?
I believe the thing is that we can really create abundance of data. And I think this is very important, because right now, the people who have abundance don't have purpose. Abundance is on the one hand centralized so far, and it's centralized under cooperative purposes or institutional purposes. We can generate abundance for citizen, for commons purposes. And that alters, in my point of view, the conditions on which the data revolution takes place. That's what I believe.
I totally agree. And maybe just to set the stage a little bit. So I wanted to just sort of highlight a couple of, as a reporter, like the initiatives that are happening in sort of the DAO-like ecosystem. And I wanted to start out actually really quickly with this cartoon, which I really like. And basically it kind of riffs off what Sylvie was saying. You know, in the past or in the present, our contributions are the things that we create on the internet are not ours. They're not tied to our person. They're tied to the spaces we occupy. So it's kind of like, you know, in the physical world, our clothes, our posters in our bedroom wall are not ours. We can't take them with us. They're tied to the room. And where we're going, or where we want to go to, is basically our possessions. Our contributions should be tied to our person, and we can take them with us as we kind of traverse cyberspace. And so similar to the physical world, our clothes, our posters are ours. We can take them with us from place to place. And how does this connect with the kind of concept of a DAO and what is a DAO? Well, really quickly, a DAO, kind of riffing off Primavera's earlier definition, you know, very simply is a community with a bank account. And to kind of connect it, why did it come from this concept of the blockchain or crypto? You know, the concept really came to prominence around this philosophy of sovereign peer-to-peer relationships that blockchain enabled. And it was first exercised in the form of cryptocurrencies, where money is the primitive. And we're sort of starting to see now a transition to people being the primitive, and kind of this philosophy around blockchain kind of applying more broadly and being exercised by communities in the form of a DAO. And at the core, this DAO kind of hints at a revolution that I think Javi mentioned, the idea of sovereignty and autonomy of the individual kind of as a central ethos, the individual as a contributor and co-owner and not an employee, this idea that kind of corporate structures are sort of changing. They're no longer kind of living in perpetuity, but they can be spun up and disbanded. And sort of the lines are blurring between the user, sort of the passive user, and the more active fan, member, and contributor. And sort of to lay out the ecosystem really quickly, again, just to report on the diversity of DAO-like structures, to highlight a couple. So there's one DAO called Forefront. There's sort of a community-led media DAO that enable participatory learning initiatives, and they have like an editorial group for articles and the like. There are DAOs for grant giving. So one's called EcoDAO. It sort of is an artists collective that supports ecological causes. So they release and promote artists' work. And when you purchase the artist's work, you get membership in this community, and all the earnings go to ecological causes. And then I wanted to highlight kind of a funny one that just came up very recently. And it's called the Constitution DAO. And I will just share my screen and show you it very quickly. This is the Constitution DAO. It's a group of people that came together to pool money to buy the constitution from Sylvie's. It's currently on auction. And it sort of spun up really quickly. They're raising a bunch of money and they just want to sort of like buy the constitution and claim it collectively as a group. And so kind of DAO-like structures take many forms. I want to just sort of lay out the landscape before we get started. So I'll pause there and pass the mic.
This is maybe a perfect moment for Stacco, right? Because Stacco, I think your work has been sort of with DisCo, right? Has been like very much a critique, right, of the existing DAOs and sort of showing who is actually doing this work and what are the shortcomings. So maybe this is a good moment for you to jump in and maybe make those points.
Yeah, for sure. It's a critique of DAOs, but it's also a critique of co-ops. I'll go back to Eugenie's comment with a reaction in a minute. So the tensions between DAOs and co-ops, why is there this mutual attraction? Based on the conversations that I've had, because we're lacking research on why there's this pull towards each other, I think that DAOs want validation for the 175-year experience of co-ops in the real world in mutualizing value. From the co-op world, what I get is that there's a lot of FOMO, fear of missing out. If cooperatives missed out on the internet revolution before lock-in became a thing, and I tried to like... Okay, thank you. I think that there's a lot of attraction from co-ops towards DAO without fully understanding what DAOs are and if the co-op world really needs them. And we're really looking at two quite different profiles. First of all, we have to look at the demographics, who is currently operating in the DAO world, what is their education, what is the level of technological awareness, what is their privilege, what is their race, what is their gender, compared to the 1 billion people who are operating in cooperative societies worldwide. And I would venture that the first group, the DAO group, is a lot more homogeneous than the latter. The second one is the issue of legality. This is something that Primavera has explored extensively. And sure, your DAO may be legally based in Gibraltar or some tax haven, but DAOs tend to run away from kind of like a legal structure being based in one particular place. When you're in a co-op, you're an individual who's based on a tax legislation. And furthermore, cooperative law varies from country to country. And even within countries, it varies, from province to state, etc., which makes that economic mutualization a bit more difficult. Another one is the issue of trust. When you enter into a cooperative, you want to mutualize the risk and benefits. You want to have trusts, and especially in smaller scale cooperatives, this trust is not delegated to a series of smart contracts. So we have to examine this tension between trustless on the DAO side and trustworthy, and whether we actually want to engage with the messiness of building trust at the human level. I think that also within DAOs, we see more transactional individualistic relationships. And with many of the DAOs, you engage as an individual within this large community, and you can engage anonymously, pseudonymously, etc. In a co-op, you have to relate to each other. You have to know where you are in comparison to your cooperative colleagues to be able to do the work. And I think this speaks to a misunderstanding between the commons, which I would define as living systems to meet shared needs based around a community, and the governance principles that they use to gather around the resource, and something like commons-based peer production, which is large projects like Wikipedia, Linux, etc. They're not the same thing, and co-ops are not the same thing as these projects. So within this, DisCo can be a marriage counselor for these relations, because we actually give governance protocols to articulate the constructions of DAOs and cooperatives based on 7 values, which actually update the existing cooperative values. So my challenge and personal provocation, both towards the DAO world and the co-op world, is check out the DisCo principles. Are you ready to become a DisCo? Are you ready to go on that journey? And what are your answers to what we're pitching? Because that will enrich the resources that we're making. To go back to Eugenie, this is nothing new. Marx was dissing co-ops in the 1870s, I believe, calling them a dwarfish form, while also, praising the Paris Commune. For a big shift in society from one mode of production to the other, the components of the next mode of production have to be in place. And then we have a catalyzing moment or series of moments where the new mode of production comes along. With cooperatives, we're talking about 2.5 million cooperative societies, 1 billion members, and an annual turnover of 3.5 trillion, which until 2018, not so since COVID, was the same as Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Apple, and Facebook. So the pre-existing conditions for a revolution in the way that we relate to each other and we produce are already there. And personally, I think that the demand for the world of tomorrow is of configurations of people that care about each other and the environment, because let's face it, capitalism is not doing so well right now. So rather than take a defeatist position on the lack of success within the same values that capitalism likes to tout and to put forward, I think that we have to take stock of the power we have, and whether it's DAOs, DisCos, and other tools, know how to aggregate that power to actually not be an economic alternative, but an actual counterpower.
That's really great. I maybe want to follow that up to say a little bit about how I think that relates to what I see on the ground, because I think Stacco covered a lot of really amazing points. I think particularly responding to the provocation, I also am not willing to take a defeatist attitude to it, because I feel like misconstruing the effort of cooperatives to produce more efficiency is just acting within the exact same kind of frameworks, capitalist frameworks. And I think it overlooks the possibility that people will start to invest more in building trust and will engage more with the messiness of building trust. And I think, so what I would say about what I've seen kind of on the ground, I work primarily in the US, and so the context is very different. And culturally speaking, a lot of people who work at the community and the local level are less familiar with cooperative structures. It's less a part of our cultural history, in recent history at least. And so there's a lot of education to be needed. So what I resonated with the most throughout this session so far has been around building more educational processes for onboarding people into these structures. And I think particularly the definitions that Sylvie provided around data trust, whether or not we use that term, are expansive enough to encompass possibilities of what people might actually generate from the bottom up and at the ground level, regardless of whether they're engaging with international communities or with, technocratic communities or any of these other like higher level mechanisms that we're theorizing about. One thing that Sylvie said that I really liked was catching people in the environments where they start caring. And I think that's a place where maybe it would benefit a lot of technologists to think about, like, what are the environments where people start caring? So an example of where I've seen that in the US is that we are going through a process of and kind of an environment where I think there's a lot of opportunity to build technology and data into existing cooperative structures or structures that are attempting to cooperatize, is in the social services space. So there's a project called Open Referral that some of you may have heard of, that's an open standard for human services data. And that project works primarily with local, very small scale community nonprofits that deliver homelessness services and other social services, health services for people who don't have access to primary care providers. And increasingly, those community level nonprofits are looking at cooperative mechanisms, are looking at data commons, are looking at other alternative data governance mechanisms to try to understand how to pool their resources on their own outside of a government context, because they're starting to realize that systems of care outside of governments have to be coordinated in order to be effective. And that works really well with the moment politically that the US is in, an abolitionist moment of trying to move away from government kind of punitive systems of care, because in the US, a lot of social care is delivered through the criminal court system. I don't know if people know that necessarily, but a lot of times the only way to get put in temporary shelter, for example, or get assigned to like a drug rehabilitation program is to be arrested and charged with a crime. And so that's our primary intake into social care in the US. And so a lot of cooperatives and commons and social care providers at the local level are trying to create more collaborative ways of sharing intake data and information, of tracking individuals in ways that give them agency and autonomy over their information, that don't create kind of punitive systems of data management when it comes to individuals who are extremely vulnerable. And that necessarily involves a conversation with people who are unhoused about how they view their own data and information. And that to me is the most potentially radical space, because it's, if anything, this is like the person who is farthest away from this conversation that we're having here today, is somebody who's living on the street and is looking for resources. And there are people at the community level trying to understand how to use data commons and cooperatives to empower those individuals and to create structures using all of the tools that we're talking about here today. So I just want to introduce that perspective and offer that there are a lot of people who work in ways that need commons governance and that need cooperative governance and need all of the principles that we're creating, but we have to go out and find them, and we have to build on top of the structures and the social structures that they already are working within. So I would also point to like anyone who has, you know, anyone here, if you could share like examples, or if you know of other examples of people working with credit unions, labor unions, other healthcare cooperatives, social care cooperatives, other kind of like places. I think somebody mentioned this earlier of like a lot of co-ops don't understand the tech part, and most people don't understand the co-ops part, but it's like, why don't we just find the people who do understand the co-ops part and work with them? So anyway, that's my context, and I'm really excited to hear ideas and hear from everyone else here.
Amazing. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, very essential parallel to the situation in Italy as well, where after 2008, a lot of social services were canceled and cooperatives jumped in to fill those gaps. For example, also through community cooperatives, where entire towns functioned essentially as one cooperative offering public services, right? So breaking through Rosa Luxemburg's criticism, breaking through Karl Marx's criticism of co-ops as only serving those within their bounds, their membership, right? Those more recent forms of cooperatives have actually acted very differently, and thereby, maybe responding to Yevgeny Morozov as well, created a value that is not the value that he is demanding, changing the DNA of capitalism, but it is offering a different value. It is offering something else, right? It's not bringing capitalism to its knees, but it's offering social value that often goes unaccounted. Who else wants to jump in next?
Concerning the question about cooperatives and DAOs, we are a contract-based organization because we co-design this contract, this license with citizens. That's the only one we're using right now. And we make researchers meet the conditions, and we meet citizens make the conditions. And I would say there are other contract-based operations. For example, Wi-Fi-Net. Wi-Fi-Net is a peer-to-peer connectivity business, no, where you buy an antenna, and through a contract, the antenna serves the community around and becomes a proprietary, not communalized within that contract, and it works perfectly. Okay. The thing is, we can run operations. We can run a logical channel and structure reality and create infrastructure or create data abundance through a contract, and that can be run distributedly and anonymously, but the governance of the contract demands cooperative principles, democratic, cooperative. So I would distinguish that we need the best of both sides. No, we can run very efficiently No, and in this way, I agree with Mogorov. No, we can run very efficiently if we agree on the contract, but yet we are trustees. No, the cooperative movement is the trustee of the contract, which runs underway.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so we're not data trustees at Salus. We don't touch the data at all. No, it's decentralized. What we are trustees, we're not data trustees. We are licensed trustees. We are the trustees of the license we design with the citizens. And that's been able to gather trust around. That's what we are.
Okay, so we have roughly 15 minutes left. If you want to use those 15 minutes, I'm happy to hear your question, facilitate the discussion. If not, it's been also a very long session, right? If you are getting a little tired or need some break, we can also end just a few minutes early. So it's up to you if you want to make use of this time and share your thoughts, or if we just call it a day. No. The silence seems to tilt towards ending early. So here Francesco asks, could Stacco share more about the projects they are working on? So there's a prompt to use Stacco, share more of the projects you are working on.
Yeah, I mean, and I can share from first-hand experience. DisCo didn't come from a white paper or a kind of like a blueprint of like, this is how the idealized governance work, but it arose within our own cooperative, which was guerrilla translation, which was already combining all of these elements. So DisCo was abstracted from this experience, which was very specific to, the place that we lived and the productive work that we were engaging in. Other people doing DisCos, there's Laneras, which is a small workshop that works with merino wool tradition in my village. There's the multi-talented makerspace, which is the first makerspace in Zimbabwe, and it's operating with feminist DisCo principles in underprivileged communities and the ghetto. Cooperation Jackson, who many of you know, is a large-scale network of cooperatives with also a political component in Jackson, Mississippi. And with them, it's more interesting, but more complex. They've also had a terrible time during COVID, so we haven't been able to engage as much as possible. But with them, we want to explore how different DisCos can get together. And beyond those, we can't keep up with the demand. We get like people writing to us 4 or 5 times a week saying, hey, we want to become a DisCo. Can you help us out, etc. And of course, we want to help by creating the resources and having the time available to DisCo-fy.
I had a quick question or perhaps a prompt, but I guess I'm really curious how you see, if it's different at all, having like in real life communities form a co-op or a DAO or a structure like this, and internet native communities of distributed individuals that are sort of coming together online. Like, I guess, what are the differences in implementation across the two? I guess this is a question for Katya, but also Stacco, Javi, if you have any comments on that too.
I guess I have to say I don't have that much experience with internet native communities, actually. I've pretty exclusively worked with in-person communities that are trying to use these techniques. And I think that to that end, I mean, it's a lot messier in some regard, because a lot of the people that I know who work in this space and who are attempting to build these cooperatives or whatever the specific mechanism is at the ground level are people who are really expert facilitators and designers, and like they're people who are more often focusing like months and months on like generating governance principles from scratch, essentially, and like doing really difficult work of like rebuilding the wheel every single time they enter a new project, because so many local governments or local community institutions are just not familiar with principles. Even if they are functionally operating a commons or like operating a public asset, they're still not familiar with the principles that are like even like de facto governing them. And you have to be, I think, really viscerally familiar with them in order to systematize them through technology. And so anyway, to make a long story short, I think a lot of people just end up spending a lot of time in person on like training, education, language, values, and the skills required for that are totally different from the technical skills required to actually build digital platforms of that nature. But I'm curious also what Stacco would say.
I mean, I agree with you, but I don't think that they're necessarily separated domains. I do think that there's a continuity. I think that it's much more exciting if we're trying to find new ways of value accounting, and our political economy is, very much based on the way that we measure value. Before delegating or validating that value in a cryptographically secure series of smart contracts, how about we have a face-to-face conversation, or a conversation within a small group that has the cognitive capacity to actually care for each other? And then you will be much better prepared not only to design DAOs, but to engage with existing DAOs, knowing what matters. I mean, you can have a group that someone may be like very technologically advanced and can share their learnings, while, to make a caricature of techies versus cooperators, someone else may be much more advanced with, relationality, etc. So again, before engaging in DAOs, before engaging in trustlessness, make sure that you know how to engage in trust, but not as an individual, but as small clusters. So instead of the agent-based approach that has been described before, it's like how we have why don't we have collectives engaging with DAOs and have these collectives have their own value sovereignty? And not everything has to be on a DAO. When I'm describing like DisCos on small collectives, engaging in DAOs, I'm not describing like side chains, which are permissioned within the collectives that then go on a public blockchain. Your own value accounting you can do with like lightweight DLTs. You don't need every single interaction to be a transaction, to be cryptographically validated. You can operate on vibe, on trust, but again, within the cognitive bounds of being able to care for those people that you're co-creating these new modes of value with.
I totally agree with all of those comments. I was just curious because I think there is, like, in the future, there's only going to be more time spent online. Our identities will be, cemented online much more than they are even today. And so I'm curious how we can kind of take a community first approach online when we're distributed, we're not together, we can't have face-to-face conversations. Perhaps, we don't even know who we are, like who each other are, and we don't know each other in person. So I was just curious how that translates, and if it does at all, or if there needs to be an entirely new system or framework for internet native communities and those types of structures. So that's why I was sort of asking that question.
Maybe if we differentiate between generating trust and escalating trust, we could see that for sure the internet allows much better to escalate trust. No, if you've got a contract or Wikipedia contributors or any open source project or the internet surely helps to escalate trust. Then the question is, can you generate trust without care? Taking DisCo into the center. Can you generate genuine care, genuine trust? Which is robust enough and transparent enough to be escalated afterwards. Can you create that from scratch? Without this dimension of actual attention. Physical, but yet attention. Maybe that's useful for the conversation.
I agree. I think it's about trust building at the first instance, and then upon a foundation of trust and understanding, you can sort of build up. And I think that's sort of where there is commonality between building, a co-op in real life or online. And I definitely agree with you there.
And I believe that this social reengineering, which are data trust, there should be like snowballs, that get bigger as they we have to build trust, and the exercise of this collective trust, no, like a snowball that we're able to roll together. Because imagine, and someone has said that before pandemics, no, the GAFAMs and the collective cooperative economy were more or less the same. After the pandemics, nothing. No, why, if we are the owners, or at least we have rights on our own data, no, we've kept behind. I mean, this is the biggest club in the world. The cooperative movement is the biggest club in the world. No, the power of commonizing those data or part of that data through easy to understand conditions safely generates a shift on the data purpose and abundance. No, that's, I believe, the vision we could. And then the tools to generate the trust among all of us. And we know the truths about escalating trust afterwards.
So in the discussions here and also at the conference in Berlin and also at this research sprint at Harvard University that the PCC is conducting, I think one of the shared insights is that there you know, like the 175, almost 200 years of cooperative history, and let's say experimentation with democratic governance, participatory democracy, right? Not by all means always a success, right? Many failures, but at least the aspiration to participatory democracy, right? For all these years, that is something that they can really bring, right? That we can bring to these experiments with technology, and also understanding that institutions like cooperatives already are organized, have a network on the ground, right? As I always say, there's a door you can open and go through and talk to people, right? And to engage with a large group of people, which in the end, I think for a lot of this is essential, right? Because it's not so much about technology, it's really about actually reaching those users, actually reaching those people on the ground. And, you know, unions and cooperatives have those networks already. They have established trust, they have established these relationships. So I think that's, for me, there is a great promise, right? In community cooperatives, in multi-stakeholder cooperatives, and worker cooperatives around the world, you know, for them to serve as a template for these emerging experiments. And one thing we need to really watch out for, and there was a bit of discussion of that, is that this kind of co-op washing that is happening all over this world, right? This world of DAOs and crypto networks, where just like the sharing economy before, right? They use these kind of narratives of counterculture, of cooperatives, of sharing to really implement commercial services, right? So that, I think, is something to watch out for. And that's why I was so pleased to hear that, you know, Primavera introduced the 7 cooperative principles, and to really have sort of principles and guidelines that can guard against that. Okay, there's maybe time for one more question. I think Sven had a comment here. I don't know, Sven, if you want to bring it up.
Yeah, just my comment is that the major thing about raising trust is to have very early activity within every kind of community, and really to get people involved in a very early stage, and to have very clear pathway for that activity to take place, because you show yourself when you are active, and that's really a problem in many of the solutions which has been showed during these days, that it's not easy to onboard and to be active at a very high level, but that's needed.
And maybe this is also a nice frame to go back to the keynote by Francesca Bria that opened the Berlin conference, where she really emphasized that you know, participatory democracy, like people-centered processes, should always precede technology, right? So to really think about how to draw on people and really implement democracy in those processes should be the first consideration, right? And maybe that's a nice thought to end on, unless somebody has a quote or Stacco wants to sing a song. Or, we would love that. We will soon share.
Please,
Stacco.
please, Stacco,
Yes,
please.
you should have seen Stacco at the conference in Berlin. He was amazing. He was a star, really amazing. Can't wait to share that with you all.
I won't sing a song, maybe another time, but I will say, I mean, just going back to the Eugene thing. I mean, you've mentioned, Trebor, the 175 years of cooperative history, but to me, cooperatives are a legal formalization of commoning. And to me, the act of commoning is the de facto mode of social organizations that we humans have had for hundreds of thousands of years. If you take the time to read the latest posthumous book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, it demonstrates that us humans have been cooperating in other ways, but history is written by the winners, and other histories are being invisibilized by the winners. So again, to Eugenia, I would say that that's a statement that to me comes from, to quote Mark Fisher, capitalist realism, and it actually upholds normativity. And I much favor the perspective of Gibson Graham that there are many alternative economies which permeate capitalism, not to mention just feminism and the gendered aspects not only of work, but of social reproduction, without which this capitalist behemoth with all its numbers would collapse. We also saw a presentation by Inigo from Mondragon, again, just giving us a sample of the, how cooperatives do with gender equity, how cooperatives do in times of economic downturns, etc. So these small or dwarfish forms that Marx would call, to me, are very successful, but also successful in ways which are more qualitative. How happy are you? How supported do you feel in a cooperative? How more ready are you for big social change on the context of planetary collapse, which, you know, is not something for the future. It's like a slow collapse that we're living through right now. So I'll leave it at that. And we will save the song for another time.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Stacco. Thank you to all of you, to Jad and all the other speakers, and everybody who has contributed. And we really look forward to seeing you tomorrow. It's the last day of virtual sessions tomorrow. We will end with a keynote by Mackenzie Walk, who will surely blow your mind if you will join. So see you tomorrow for more sessions. And good afternoon, good morning, and goodbye.